Today, I'm joined by George Marshall. George is a British environmental campaigner, communications specialist, and writer. He is the founder of Climate Outreach and is a specialist in climate communication. He is the author of Carbon Detox and Don't Even Think About It: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. Thank you very much for joining me, George.
Oh, you're very welcome. Nice to talk to you, Xavier.
Well, look, there's a lot of things we can talk about today. The primary sort of catalyst for wanting to reach out was a research paper that you'd recently written with a few of your colleagues from the University of Queensland. And it's all about intergroup conflict as it concerns climate change, the types of intergroup conflicts that may slow down mitigation on climate change and may potentially increase the action on climate change if we're able to resolve those conflicts. So I thought, to start off with, your paper is centered on the theme of social psychology and environmental psychology broadly. And I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are in terms of the importance and the role of social psychology and environmental psychology in mitigating climate change.
I think absolutely critical and better understood now, but seriously underestimated. I think the climate policy world has been operating under some kind of delusion that economics used to. Economics, you talk about homo economicus, this kind of perfectly configured rational person who makes decisions on kind of, cost benefit analysis and building models on the assumption that people behave rationally. And clearly they don't. One of the people I interviewed for my book, Don't Even Think About It, was Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. Now, Danny Kahneman is a psychologist. And the reason he won the Nobel Prize in Economics was because he pointed out that actually people's real decisions are completely driven by both an internal cognitive bias, that was his speciality, but what we would add to that maybe from social psychology is a social bias. But there's all kinds of ways that we behave in response to society, cultural cues, the norms around us. And that these aren't minor, but these can be completely decisive in terms of our behavior, our attitudes, our performance. And I must say, I see it everywhere within the climate change field, at every single level, from the most senior policymakers, from the people who are heads of industries, from fossil fuel companies or polluting industries, right down to the level of personal behaviors, activists. Every single thing is determined by complex social psychological principles. And yes, if we don't understand that, we're going to get things seriously wrong, as indeed I have to say we have done already. Look, let's face it, we're not doing very well on climate change, to put it mildly. In fact, we're catastrophically badly. And I think in large part that's because we haven't actually anticipated how challenging climate change is for us psychologically, and how challenging it is from a social point of view. It's just being treated as if this was an engineering problem, a technical problem, and with a simple cause and effect. If we just reduce those emissions, then we can, then we can solve a problem, and it's not by any means that easy. So yes, I think it. So I think climate change really it's a very complex issue which relates to every aspect of our lives, and therefore, in terms of understanding it, we need to have a multidisciplinary approach which brings in every discipline. And when I started working on climate change, like so in a really major way about 25 years ago, it was absolutely remarkable how little attention was being paid by any of the disciplines outside the earth sciences and a little corner of climate change economics and climate change policy, when this was clearly an issue that was going to affect absolutely everything. And that has now broadened, but it's still seriously underestimated. If I can give you an example,
Go
Xavier,
ahead.
you know, one of the things I've done is specialized in the communications of carbon pricing. And the assumption on the part of economists was always that carbon pricing was a very efficient and effective economic tool, that if you could just simply change the cost balance between fossil fuels and renewables, that therefore the market would do its magic. Well, you could certainly you could certainly challenge that alone in terms of the economics of it. But but they saw this as being just relatively straightforward and simple, um, you know, simple policy measure. And that
Mm,
therefore all of the complexity was hidden in the details of, well, where did you put the tax and how do you implement it and so on. And they got it utterly, utterly wrong. I mean, as we know in the case of your country in Australia, disastrously wrong.
mm,
But they completely underestimated what would happen with public opinion, how people would respond to it, and below that, the psychological motives whereby people would react to this kind of level of interference from the government. Um,
mm,
and we see this happening time and again. But when you try and bring in a policy, never mind if we try and bring in policies regarding stuff that people see as a core part of their identity, and it's this
mm,
identity which is really critical. Things like, my right to have a barbecue or a steak or to fly anywhere that I want. And
mm,
then we really run into the buffers.
mm. Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's a very good way to sort of summarize the whole points. And I mean, even speaking of carbon pricing, it's quite timely because I just didn't finish my thesis all about carbon markets. And it's interesting that you mentioned Australia and many other countries as well. I think Canada at the moment is probably going to see a change of government in the next few months and potentially see the appeal, the repealing of their climate carbon tax. But like you said, it ignores all the complexity of social dynamics of groups and even underestimating psychology as a role in instigating change on climate change. But you,
And also underestimates the importance and the role of research. You know,
mm,
I have here on my shelves here the two-volume set of the Oxford University Press Guide to the Communication of Climate Change. I mean, it's that thick. You know, it's like it's
mm,
100 centimeters thick. This enormous slab of international research, and governments just ignore it. That's what worries me, is that this work is happening sometimes in isolation.
mm,
You know, in the case of a Canadian carbon pricing, there was a large body of research in Canada that showed that the government was adopting a policy that would actually fit very badly with the public and public attitudes, but the way
mm,
that they were communicating it was badly done. I had a meeting directly with a minister in which I said this, um, and they still went ahead and did it. And you just go, well, you've kind of, you've
mm.
got, yeah, and it's happening again and again and again, you know.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, another example of that before I zoom out and sort of take stock of what we just talked about and move on is that we recently had on a climate communicator looking at, Shakespeare and other sort of English literature, and she talks about all the philosophy of implicature, the implication of words, and how they are misused by the fossil fuel industry as well as other players to purposely misrepresent or even create sort of mental images about what is happening, how fast it's happening in terms of climate change impact, etc. But, to summarize, it seems like there's two things. We have these multidisciplinary perspectives that are necessary in order to understand and mitigate climate change. But on top of that, we also require synthesis of those perspectives, because without actually synthesizing those multidisciplinary perspectives in order to create something that everyone is on the same page of, it's almost as if that research is rendered ineffective. I mean, you talked about your book, George. It's been a few years since it's been out, and it's been widely acclaimed as a very key piece of research. And you talk about climate communications and its importance for not only communicating effectively, but communicating effectively on the point of climate change, which is historically, as you mentioned, in the case of carbon markets and whatnot, has not been put into consideration. And as a consequence of that, it has impacted the public's perception of climate change, its role, the role of policy. So, for example, in Australia, listeners will know because I've mentioned it before, Australia is the first country to implement and then repeal a carbon tax. Um,
Yeah.
but, taking into consideration the importance of how to communicate about climate change is important. So, can you help us understand, effective ways that we can communicate about climate change and maybe how this connects to your book more broadly?
So the most important thing is that we recognize that people's attitudes to climate change are uh, deeply embedded and a product of um, their identity, or maybe we should say their perception of their identity. So when we people's resistance to climate change is usually and invariably, in my experience, because it conflicts with their identity. There's a sense that that who they are is being undermined, is being attacked, that something is being taken away from them, but something is being taken away from their group and is being offered to another group. So that's where this issue of intergroup conflict comes in particularly. That people hold a view of a world within which they are paramount, and that's usually expressed in the forms of narrative structures. This is who I am. This is what's important to me. This is how I come to be where I am, and this is this is where I and my social group are going. Um, when we then come in with climate policy that appears to take that away, that is then the point at which people react. And therefore, in answer to your question, the way that we need to express climate change effectively is to respect, recognize, and respond and reflect people's identity and their worldview. So the configuration I normally hold on this is to say it starts with respect, to say this is who you are. We're reflecting that back to you in a very validating way. What you are is important, worthwhile, worthy of respect. The things you care about are really important to you, and rightly so, and that they are things that you are quite right to be concerned about, and that therefore, when we come to climate change, what we're doing here is addressing your concerns, we're respecting your values, and we're coming up with policy responses which are making the world the way you would like it to be. In other words, we frame the language of climate response in the terms of what's important to them. And where we can see that this works very well, for example, is if we were speaking in Australia to farming community, for example. I've done a lot of work in Ireland, advising the government on communications there, and they have a very large farming community in Ireland. You would start with a validation of saying you're really important. You're the backbone of our country. You're the custodians of the land. You understand better than anybody how important the land is. You understand the weather very well. We have a problem here. We need to address it. We have a problem in terms of changing seasons, but we might also bring in other problems we need to address, which are not directly about climate change. For example, big concern of farmers are younger generations leaving the land. So we might say, for example, well, if we take action on this, if we follow this policy, this is a way of reinvesting in the land and providing new economic opportunities, but of a kind that can hold your young people onto the land to give them new opportunities. So we're always shaping and framing what we do in terms of the values and concerns of the audience whilst validating them. And where communications go wrong is when we do the opposite of that, where we start saying, what you do, you are the problem. You are the problem. You need to change what you are doing, and you need to be more like this, which is not like you. In other words, a kind of like a forced change, rather than a sense of continuity where you say you're important and you have a contribution you can make to the
Mm.
changes, but you have something which is a false change. And my concern for a very long time, as somebody who, as you said, has a background in campaigning, is that my dear friends and colleagues within the climate change activist community do not understand this core principle and continue to go into this conversation in a way that says, you are wrong, you need to be more like us. And then they wonder why we have massive resistance.
Mm.
Um, so, and again, going back to what we were saying before, all of this is grounded in understanding of the social psychology of identity and the way that conflict arises from the friction between different views of a world and different
Mm.
sense of identity.
Mm. Do, uh, yeah, I this reminds me of a problem that I've encountered with friends in the past where I speak about, the typical political ideological divides on the problem of climate change. So, for example, left versus right divides, and speaking to friends about this, thinking, you know, if we fail to consider the needs and the values and etc. of the other side, even if they're in opposition to climate change, that is going to sort of, you're going to invigorate that sort of intergroup conflict, right? For example, in America or in the United Kingdom, for example, I'll stick with America. The re-election of Donald Trump, in some part, it may be a result of this intergroup conflict being inflamed. So, for example, I know there's a Michael Mann who's a really prominent climate scientist, and if you go on his Twitter page, you'll see examples of him sort of lambasting
Yeah.
people on the right. You know, there's multiple examples of this on both sides, but it seems to be reinvigorating this intergroup conflict, and it almost seems as though the actual identity or identifying with the ideological group gets in the way of climate change because it inflames that conflict. Do you see identity in that way potentially being a roadblock to climate change? Whereas if we just took a step back and said, look, we just need to look at best policy and we need to consider the needs of people, putting political ideology aside. You know, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think this is a very good example of why social psychology is absolutely essential. You
Mm,
cannot do that.
mm,
You cannot separate people from their identity, nor can you ask that people do that.
mm,
And the undervaluation of the importance of this is exactly why we run into these conflicts.
mm,
Um, we are social animals in every way. We seek to be a part of our social group, and we seek to belong. And we of course have multiple intersecting identities. It's not as simple as
mm,
saying I'm this person or I'm that person. Um, but within those intersections, we nonetheless we put together a kind of a mosaic which represents our own position in the world. It is
mm,
extremely unwise to um, ignore that. And what I'd say is rather than seeing it as a problem or a roadblock, I'd say let's see this as um, uh, something we have to work with, but actually as an opportunity. I
mm,
mean, you know, humans have we have immense capacity for self-sacrifice, altruism, generosity, pro-social behaviors, if and when we feel that what we're doing is in the interests of a wider group. This is very much built into us through our um, social and psychological evolution. So we've got these conflicting tensions between, on the one hand, a very strong commitment, which may go the whole way towards personal sacrifice for our own group, in defense of that group against maybe other groups. We have the balance between the internal pro-social behaviors, but also the antagonism and conflict we might feel towards other competing groups. And it's always the balance between these two. The trick for climate change, which is a global problem, is we have to find a way of both making people feel that this is something which is important for their own identity, but also trying to reduce the level of friction that they have, of competitive friction between the social groups. In other words, of saying that this is a form within which you can maintain your own identity and your own pride in who you are, but you do so in a form of collaboration with other groups who may very well have their own identities, with which you, by the way, you don't have to necessarily agree. And we know that we can do this in the case of overarching threats. I mean, war, of course, is the classic one where everybody from across the board will come together against, against a
mm,
uniting enemy or a uniting threat. To some degree, it happened in COVID. We know that in COVID there was some
mm,
um, there were dissenters and there were anti-vaxxers, and it got caught up with these wider social schisms. But actually, I think the key lesson of COVID was how remarkably strongly people responded and collaborated around COVID, both both internally in their communities and countries, but also internationally. I mean, the degree of collaboration, I think, was quite impressive. Now, climate change is harder in many ways because there's a lot of vested interests, and it's a much wider, more amorphous issue. There are a lot of wider issues, but I think building the important thing is that we build a collective identity around action on climate change. We
mm,
don't allow that identitarian aspect of climate change to be owned by any one group or another. And that is why we have a particularly dangerous situation in the US, but it spills out actually across the world, particularly the Anglophone world, that identity in climate action becomes one part of a political spectrum, and that you take action on climate change because it's part and parcel of who you are, alongside a
Mm,
list of other identity-related issues. I remember being in the States, and it was for one of the elections, and people would have things out in on their front lawn, because they do in the States, to declare who they are. And someone would say, I'm pro-choice, I'm anti-guns, I'm pro-LGBTQ plus, and I'm pro-climate action. Vote Democrat. And it's the way that all of these conflicting issues get bundled up into one identity, which is toxic. And I think leads to a lot of the problems,
mm,
we have. Incidentally, by the way, on these political divisions, there's plenty of research to show that, well, first of all, to show that the political divisions on political worldview are pretty well global. I mean, Matthew Hornsey and his colleagues at University of Queensland, we wrote the paper together. They've also done really important work looking at the global influences on climate change attitudes, and absolutely jumping ahead of the rest of the pack. We got, young people care more than old, and women to some degree more than men, and so on. But jumping ahead of the pack is this issue of your political identity, and in particular, left wing, right wing. Conservatives are less engaged with climate change than people on the left. That is exacerbated and amplified by the way that it then falls into these culture wars and becomes the property of one side or another. And
mm,
um, and this is catastrophic in terms of moving forward with policy, as we're seeing with the wave of the far right now moving across, the US and across Europe. And the far right has adopted blocking climate action as being
mm,
one of its
mm.
key markers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on the point of, instead of saying, focusing on identity is not the issue and removing identity, it sounds like, in summary, the point is to say focusing on one particular identity and have it as a narrow identity. For example, left and right is too narrow of a scope, and rather we need to look at a wider collective identity that encompasses people across the political spectrum, so as to engage climate change more effectively. And I think a good example of this locally in Australia is a former member of Parliament, Matt Keane, he's on the Liberal Party, which in Australia is the Conservative Party, and he recently resigned. He was the treasurer for one of the states, for the state, and he was also a energy minister. And he resigned to become the head of what's called the Climate Change Authority, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
a chief body on climate change, yeah, locally. And I think this is one of the more prominent conservative politicians, leaders in Australia that I know of, and as well as internationally, I must say. Um, uh, and I think it's a good example of how, if you focus on the more broader collective issue of climate change, rather as a political issue, you can really mobilize action. And so, some really good steps that he's been taking is actually pushing against his colleagues and saying, "Look, this is not a political issue. This is a global issue." And I think that just goes to the point that you were making. Um, now,
Well,
I
on that
think,
on that point,
yeah,
if I can just sort of
please,
if I just
please.
follow up on that, the when we're looking at these political divides and these kind of the as it were, the intertribal conflict which happens along the political lines, the most important place for action is on the right, of exactly of this kind, of generating and mobilizing voices on the right who can be clearly identified as conservatives, saying climate change, actually not just for climate change as a non-political issue, but climate change is our issue. Because
Mm,
that's what I would say is the answer on this. It's a combination of the two. It's of having a range of different identities, including particularly these kind of this political worldview identity, taking ownership of climate change on their own terms, of saying this is our issue, and in a pure way, this is our issue because it relates directly to who we are, and in a second way of saying, and we need to work alongside other people with who we don't normally work and who we might disagree, because we all have something important to contribute to this wider issue, and that this is a collective threat. So it's both. I think that means that from conservatives need to be standing up and saying climate change is a very conservative issue. I've done a lot of work on specifically this issue of how to speak better to people of the right, maybe more the centre right politics. And one of the one of the key things which came up on the early research that we did at Climate Outreach was that this language of saying this is too important to be left to the other tribe, to the other team. We need to take ownership of it because they are mucking it up. This kind of narrative works actually very well for conservatives. Conservatives need to be concerned that they can't just sit there and complain about the way that people on the left respond to climate change. They have to be an active part of a conversation, because this is a huge issue in which their voice needs to be present. Incidentally, interestingly, that kind of language also, and that narrative works very well with other groups too. It emerged very strongly in work that we did with trades unionists. So a very different group there. For the trades unionists, who also, by the way, are not necessarily great fans of environmentalists, where they would say, yeah, this is a trades union issue. The trades union voice, the call for social justice, the call for workers' rights needs to be in this conversation, and it isn't at the moment. So in other words, for people to feel that what they have to offer is particularly important, that they need to be a part of it, first off. Secondly, that they feel that they're part of this, that they're part of this collective wider identity. And I think in retrospect, although it's directly relevant now, I think there has been a major abnegation of responsibility on the part of conservatives to stepping up to the mark and to really taking action on climate change. You know, the astonishing party conference speech by Margaret Thatcher back in 1988, where she stood up in front of the Conservative Party, and she was a radical right-wing voice in conservatism, standing up and saying climate change is an issue that we must be involved with. This is a conservative issue, and that's why we are going to lead the world on this issue, and shaping it entirely in terms of a conservative narrative of responsibility. The final line on her speech was, the more we master the environment, the more we must learn to serve it. This language of mastering and serving, this very conservative language. Well, she took a lead on that, and I think conservatives have completely blown it. And that's why that's one of the reasons why we're in this horrible, messy situation right now. And personally, I'm no fan of some of Margaret Thatcher's other policies, but crikey, she got it. And there's nothing, as you were saying, there's nothing inherently on this issue which is left wing or right wing, but it has become poison it's become poison with political identity meaning. And we cannot solve this problem until we find this sense of unification.
Absolutely. And there's a book by Jeff Sparrow, all about these sort of it's a Marxist perspective on climate change. And one of the interesting points that he brings up in his book is this mention of how biological conservation, so conservation efforts, in some sense, stemmed from the right wing in the I think it was early 20th century, late 19th century. And talking about this need to conserve, to maintain the land, to maintain our forests, all those sorts of things. So it's interesting that you bring that up, about Margaret Thatcher, because it seems to be consonant with its political past.
So again, if we're talking about the importance of social psychology, that's a narrative. That's a narrative which cherry picks little nuggets of story in order to build a larger identity narrative. I mean, you hear this a lot in the US. Yeah, sure. So Teddy Roosevelt as president brought in the first national park. Sure, he did that because he was. Because he wanted to go off and shoot things. He was a hunter. By the way, also on that point, of course,
Mm,
the people on the left not recognizing that hunters can play a major role in the conservation of the
mm,
environment and
yeah,
often
absolutely.
raised them. So, there's a but picking out these little stories, and again you hear a lot about how Nixon brought in a whole wave of environmental laws. Yeah, sure, he did so in the context of a much wider social debate with a great deal of
Mm,
activism that was generating it. I will say though, my experience usually in politics has been that 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 very important things are brought in by conservatives because they're the ones that can get it through. In other words, if when stuff comes in from the left, it gets fought and it gets resisted. But when stuff comes in from the right, if they own the political process, if we can get people on the right to agree on issues like climate change, there's a much stronger chance of getting it through. In Britain, we had the Climate Change Act, which was brought in by a Labour government, but with the agreement of Conservatives at that point, because the then leader, David Cameron, saw climate change as the kind of issue around which the Conservatives could rebrand themselves and their own identity. The carbon taxing, for example, in British Columbia was brought in by a Conservative premier. Um, and therefore, actually, interestingly, the one little bit of opposition it did get was actually from people on the left, but nonetheless it went in. So if we can get conservatives to adopt stuff, I personally think although it was a very difficult election, but I think John McCain, had he won the presidency in the US, would have moved the climate change situation along a great deal further, and possibly have diffused
mm,
some of this intense acrimony between the two sides. Of course, it was a hard
mm,
election because he was up against Obama, who was, an astonishing candidate.
absolutely. Well, on the point of, I think, on the point of parties bringing in certain types of legislation, like you're saying that perhaps it's more important that you have a oppositional leader or a leader that's perceived to be oppositional to, or a party opposition to environmental legislation. There was a recent paper by a group of professors, I think in Australia, where they look at political ideology and policy goals, and they show that. Based on their research, that it is conservative governments on average that protect the more land compared to socialists, which I think is an interesting point. But perhaps and I need to dig into it. I haven't had a chance, but yeah, I think it goes to your point of what you're saying is that having bipartisan policy where you can gain what do you call it, focusing on trusted messengers, focusing on people that you trust across
Yes,
the aisle to communicate messages to their constituency is perhaps one of the most important steps to mitigating the worst effects of climate change.
it was something. It was something we talked about in we talked about in our paper.
Mm,
My own view from field research is that the messenger is often more important than the message. You know,
mm,
Psychologically, we use messengers as a kind of heuristic. That's to
mm,
say, a heuristic is a mental shortcut, way that we can move rapidly towards an evaluation of a situation, um, based on sort of like tested principles. Like, okay, that we tend cognitively to jump to conclusions based on past experience. And so we look at the person who's telling us and we just do a very quick calculation. Is this person like me, first and foremost? Do they appear to be like me? Do they seem to share my worldview, my values, my life experience? Is it someone I like? And of course, whether you like someone
mm.
or not is also very connected with whether you feel that they're, that
Yeah.
they're similar to you. Not always, but similar. Um, the classic kind of question in American politics is, who do you sooner have a beer with? Um,
Mm,
and do they seem to know what they're talking about? The attacks which are often made strategically against messengers, like Al Gore very much comes. Well, of course, he would say that because he's making a fortune out of renewables. Similar attacks, for example, on Bill Gates. So you would say we can't trust this person as a messenger because actually what they're saying is furthering their own interests. Um, and but the point why I say messengers are maybe more important than message is I think if you have the right messenger, that person will automatically um, and intuitively find the right messages for people who are like themselves. Um, and that means you can cut out all of that stuff, all about doing the research and finding out what works and what doesn't work, and finding the right words and right framing. But as somebody who is a gifted communicator who knows their audience well, immediately hone in on the right way of talking, and will pepper and litter their language with these little identity markers, these like little flashing lights saying it's you I'm talking to, it's you. Yes, these are the words you use. I mean, at a big scale, I'm going to have to say that Donald Trump is really rather good at this. But
Mm,
all good communicators do this. I think, by the way, very interesting work has been done. I think particularly in Australia on finding ways of getting people to talk to people like themselves. Like there's a group in Australia, Farmers for Climate Action, which I
mm,
really like. They have avoided the trap of having boutique farmers who have a little organic smallholding, and they've
mm,
got spokespeople who are people of quite large ranches, and
mm,
they look in every way, they look, sound, and they are farmers to the core. And
mm,
therefore, when they speak straight. Farmers speak, they use the right word, they look the right way, they can say, this is my holding, this is how many heads of cattle I have, this is what I do, this is why I care about these issues. And I think
mm,
that's powerful because identity is not just about who you are, it is about who you are not. And
mm,
you can say, I'm not like this. There was a guy years ago I worked with who had worked for BP, and he went around talking to Rotary clubs. And I very much encouraged him to go when he spoke to Rotary clubs and say, I am not a member of Greenpeace. We've had huge problems with them. I'm not this. But I said, actually, sometimes marking out the conflicting line of saying what you're not, quite an important
mm,
identity marker. But then he could say with integrity, but I really care about climate change. It goes back to that thing of how really trusted communicators appear to be operating against type. So you don't say, oh, well, that's what they would say anyway. You go, that's interesting. I didn't expect that person to say that, because it gives
mm,
people a lot more authenticity when they appear to not when they are not being what you would expect. So someone from the oil industry saying, actually, I think we've got it wrong. Climate change is important. Or there's a guy who's been working with Extinction Rebellion here in the UK who is a flew planes and trained up to be a commercial air pilot, and then stopped doing it and said, "I can't do this anymore because because I'm really concerned about the ethics." So that's an integrity. It's like he's not
mm,
person of interest. He's someone who's going against an interest, like huge amounts of money. And he just goes, "I cannot do this any longer." That's, I think, when people start listening.
mm, mm, mm. So much to summarize. I think you've touched on a lot of good points, and I think it's something that the internet does particularly well, which is looking at groups of people that uh, have a particular background. So there's a lot of political YouTubers or political streamers or whatnot, but they're able to not distance themselves. They're able to differentiate themselves from the traditional institutional sort of left or right background by being themselves, and because of that, like you said, it creates a certain sense of authenticity, and in some ways, they're able to bridge the gap between political aisles because of that authenticity. Um, so I think it's a really, really good point. And touching on Farmers for Climate in Australia, for example, there was a recent survey that came out by that organisation, and I think 82 or 87% of farmers in Australia are for more action on climate change and are pro renewables, things like that. And I think it goes to show about the importance of having those people that can communicate towards people, towards the identity that they sort of align with, and have the values that they align with, and be able to be be receptive to those ideas, essentially.
There's another
Um,
thing. There's another thing in this as well, which is that um, we've been talking a lot in activist circles, of course, a lot of conversations on the left about intersectionality and about diversity. But it's always astonishing to me that's how selective that vision often
Yeah,
is of
absolutely.
diversity. That I have an exercise I always do if I'm doing a kind of like a communications training, for example,
Mm.
with an activist group, where we have a whole conversation on diversity, and when I say, okay, hands up, everyone in this room who has never voted for a right of centre party, and every every hand. I
Yeah,
don't ask who's voted for a right of centre party
yeah.
because then that would kind of might embarrass them. I say who hasn't. Um, every single hand goes up, and I go, well, I think we've got a bit of a diversity issue here, because I think you'll find
Yeah.
that half the population vote for right of centre parties, in some cases more,
Mm.
and and they're not present in this room. So it's it's the thought, yeah, it's creating a space which has a true understanding of a diversity. It's allowing the voice of, as you say, of people who feel they haven't been heard adequately, but also emerging from other aspects of diversity, for example, of having gender diversity or racial diversity. People who dominate the field have to step back a bit.
Mm.
And as somebody who is absolutely in the problem demographic of kind of like older well-educated white men, I'm very keenly aware of that. But I think the conversation is so dominated by one particular group. If we want to move forward on climate change, if we want that 85% of farmers to have a voice, that requires the people who shout very loudly to maybe step back a little bit and allow the podium to people who, in other ways, they might not agree with. Because probably quite a lot of those
Mm.
farmers would vote National Party or would have other views they don't like. It's like, okay,
Mm.
well, we don't have to agree on everything.
Mm. Well, I mean, so this comes to a point as well, which I 100% agree with you, and in some sense, I want to push back and or try and sort of figure out how to best navigate this idea of, there's people across the political aisle. I mean, I'm invoking this intergroup already, so I'm it's sort of demonstrating one of the issues. But anywho, people across the political aisle, so people on the right, right of center, who do not believe in climate change, but we also acknowledge that they need to be involved in the conversation because without them, uh, getting issues of climate change, passing legislation, all those sorts of things on issues of climate change becomes increasingly difficult. So, how do we begin to actually do that? So, we talk about expanding the collective, saying it's not just left or right. We're people, we're husbands, we're wives, we're brothers, we're sisters.
Yeah.
We can expand that collective. But what else can we do? Because I think a lot of people in their experience, in their personal experience, anecdotal experience, they'll say, like I've tried talking to these people, they're not interested, right? They're not interested in having a conversation about this. So how do we sort of confront this sort of inevitability of sort of diametrically opposed beliefs sort of crashing up against each other, and even though we acknowledge that we need to overcome it, it almost feels as though it's not, I won't say impossible because that's a very agentic sort of position, but you get what I'm saying. What can we do?
Well, I mean, I'm on the call because we wrote a paper from the University of Queensland. We identified a few ways of doing this. Um, there is a sense that through the justice and concentrating on a sense of fairness, that we can bridge things.
Mm,
I think we can say definitely that climate change isn't fair. I know from my own qualitative research that this issue of fairness strikes very strongly across the spectrum. Although we have to be careful that the frame of fairness or justice has conflicting meaning for people of different politics. So I think people on the left see fairness much more in terms of equality, and people on the right see fairness much more in terms of of a kind of like a natural justice that that the
mm,
good get rewarded and the bad get punished. This kind of like
mm, mm,
just world kind of approach. Um, but I think there is something very important in that. Incidentally, in we when we were doing the research on um, communicating in Canada around the carbon tax in Canada, the language which performed best in large scale testing was around fairness. We say that this is a fair way because the people who are causing the pollution have to pay more. They have to make a bigger contribution because of the pollution they're producing.
Mm.
Whereas the people who do the right thing, that they move towards cleaner sources, can get rewarded. And I think that's important. I think we have to be very careful of we have to really address this, the misinformation which is going out. I mean, I remember back in, uh, 2010 or so, people were saying, and the scientific community also saying, "Oh, don't pay any attention to this kind of like to this misinformation, to these climate deniers. Um, they're going away. We see that they're fading away because the evidence is now overwhelming." That, I have to say, is very much the identity of scientists.
Yeah.
Scientists and the scientific worldview is convinced that data can overwhelm social bias because they are coming at it from a data-driven culture and they do not understand the social psychological culture within which what happens within your social group becomes truth. But your truth is defined by social truth. Anyway, they were wrong, and they continue to be wrong, and it doesn't fade away. I think we have to really aggressively focus on it. My view, by the way, on that is that that is not something which should be done by activists. I think that government has a fundamental role in terms of doing large-scale public engagement to explain to people what climate change is, how it's going to affect their lives, and what's important to them. And
Mm.
they've really failed to do that. And in every country, I can say with confidence, every country might be listening to your podcast, it's the same, because really no country has done it properly. No country has really funded and supported a long-term program to build the climate literacy of their general public. We're not asking
Mm.
for much. People need to understand it's here, it's real, it's really bloody serious. It's caused by burning fossil fuels, some other things we might talk about as well. I think people need to understand the role in particular of beef and sheep production. Um,
Mm.
um, and aspects of diet, but there are solutions. We can all work together. It's going to be hard and difficult, but we can do it. That kind of basic information is amazing and disturbing how ignorant people still are. They have a kind of vague, foggy understanding. But when we went into COVID, governments spent a lot of money, often misspent in my view, but they spent a lot of money on trying to communicate to people what was causing climate change, the actions they needed to take. But this was serious, this was important, we could all come together, it's going to be hard. Basically the same things. And
Mm.
to some degree challenging misinformation. It's a bit of a no-brainer, really. We really need to do this. Um, I think I kind of make a final point on this is that I
Mm.
I think that one of the openings for building a collective social contract on climate action relates around responding to climate extremes. Um, it's a consistent pattern in places which have had extreme weather events that people come together. We've been
Mm.
talking about conflict, about what pushes people apart. But what brings people together is often a combined problem. Now, the thing with climate change is it's such a huge global problem and it's up in the air, but it's a hard thing to bring people together around. It doesn't have a clear enemy except all of us, and we're causing it. It's a very diffuse problem, and lots of people are causing it. But if you have a local issue, you have a major issue of local flooding or local storm, then it's much more focused and it's something that cognitively we deal with much better. It's here,
Mm.
it's now, there's a clear enemy. This thing was causing us harm. And people really come together around it. And you get, extraordinary acts of kindness and generosity and altruism. I did interviews in the United States along New Jersey seaboard. I think it was just a month after Hurricane Sandy. And people were talking, that's all they wanted to talk about was how their community had come together and how it had been really hard, how they felt much closer to their neighbors. But also, interestingly, people specifically say, Bob next door, he's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, we never got along. Now we're really good friends. We talk all the time. We don't talk about politics, but we talk about other things. People were really pleased that this was a sense that they'd come together over. And so I think there is a wave of coming together through climate extremes build community,
Mm,
but but in New Jersey and other places, they're not talking about climate change. So in other words, the community comes together, but it's not talking about climate change because that's exactly where me and my neighbor
mm,
Bob don't want to talk about. And I think so that's the interesting challenge is how can we get people's responses to extreme weather events to shift towards a collective identification with climate change and climate action as a collective threat and a collective action. And
mm,
it is happening bit by bit. I mean, in Australia, where you had the Black Summer and the
mm.
horrible, horrible bushfires, there was a shift in public opinion, and quite a marked
Yeah.
one, towards stronger concern about climate change and support for climate action. But I have to say, it's like one of those glass half full, glass half empty things. The advocates were saying this is great, but I looked at the figures, I thought, wow, there's still a very large number of people in Australia, particularly on the political right, who haven't been shifted by this. You kind of wonder
Mm,
what is going to shift them. And I
yeah.
think, in a
Mhm.
way, part of where that moves is on having locally based conversations, of having people across the country, any country, at a local level saying climate change is real, it's here, it's now, we're seeing the impacts already. How can we prepare for this? What do we need to do? There's an opportunity there for building awareness of the problem on the basis of very sensible, focused, locally based collaborative action.
Mm,
Certainly that's where I put my money. Like if a government said, here's 50 million, which is the kind of sort of figures we need to be talking about to put into
mm,
it. I'd say, great, let's do it around local conversations between social peers within communities.
mm, hmm. Absolutely. And I think there's a really good quote that sort of surmises that point of having opposition, an enemy, so to speak, in order to mobilize action. It's by this monk, which seems a bit counterintuitive, but he says his name is Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a Vietnamese
Yeah.
monk, and he says, in order to rally people, governments need enemies, and if they do not have a real enemy, they'll invent one in order to mobilize us. Which
It,
I think it gets to this point of you, like you said, you need that those sort of enemies, or in, for example, greenhouse gases, the sort of metaphorical big baddie, to instigate change. Without that, it's very difficult to do. Um, but I
and
think,
this is enormously the weakness with climate change as a narrative construction. And again, we have this problem that the people who have been leading on this have no understanding of kind of cognitive linguistics. So they just create terms like net zero, and they don't go, well, hang about, does this work? Does this fly? What does this say to people? How do people frame this in their minds? So you get these, well, climate change and global warming are both far from ideal as phrases, and we always kind of like struggle,
mm,
and we struggle with that. And yeah, and climate change doesn't have an enemy. It's a real problem. Can I add something on that?
please,
In terms of our moral structures, intentionality is critically important. We are very attuned as humans to intentionality. It's quite interesting. And by the way, not just humans. I think some animals can do it as well. I think like smart animals like dogs can do it. Um, of being able to tell the difference between an act that's intended to hurt and an act that doesn't. I mean, kids can start doing this from the age of like 2, 3, but they can understand the difference between somebody who dropped something on them by accident or someone who deliberately hit them. They can tell the difference. So intentionality is so critical. So it's not just having the enemy, it's having the enemy who has the intention, the deliberate intention to cause harm. And climate change, I think, really struggles from the fact that there is no intentionality in it. Like nobody intends to cause harm. When we travel, I've got my boiler at the moment. It's still gas. I have a gas boiler. When I put my boiler on, I'm not thinking, aha, this will really stuff up Bangladesh. I'm just putting my boiler on because I want to heat my house. And so much of what climate change does is about just looking after ourselves, and often pro-social things, caring for each other. Most flying is either associated with work or with family or with friends, going to a friend's wedding or going and seeing your mother or going and taking your kids on holiday, or so that makes it even worse. It's the intention to do good is often associated with climate change. So it's very, very tricky. So you've got this huge problem with nowhere to fit it into our moral framework. And that as your quote says, means that people then project onto it the enemy narrative that they have. Now, if you had as a thought experiment, if North Korea was pumping gases into the atmosphere that had the potential of wiping out grain production in the
Mm.
American Midwest, you'd better believe that action would be quick and immediate, that there'd be no cost considerations, there would be
Yeah.
global unity. So that works. And by the way, there was that thing recently about a very successful Netflix film called Don't Look Up, about a
Mm.
meteorite. That was not a good metaphor for climate change, although I love the idea of a metaphor. It's great to
Yeah.
talk about climate change without talking about climate change. But the fact is, that is a very easy problem for us
Mm.
to think our heads about. There's a point of impact. It's here. It's now. It's going to smash into the earth. You know when it's going to do it. There's an enemy. There's a bloody big meteorite. Not an
Yeah.
intentional enemy, but good enough. COVID is an intentional enemy. COVID, the virus wants to infect us, and it doesn't
Mm.
care if it kills us in doing it. Well, that's a sort of viral intention. So
Mm.
so then you get these narratives which are filled with other things. So you just go, it's fossil fuel companies. Well, the
Mm.
intention's a bit hard, but you can say they've known all along and they don't care because they're greedy. Bill McKibben, a big climate action, says, yeah, as a movement, we need enemies. The enemy is fossil fuel industry. Well, yeah, I get that. But then people working in the fossil fuel industry then will flip the other way and they say, no, the enemy is environmentalists because they want to wipe out our livelihood and
Mm.
and destroy our jobs. And so and by the way, they could probably prove quite a bit of intention in that.
Mm.
Again, it's not like environmentalists want to put them out of work, but by so doing, and then there's a whole lot of debate in the middle of that. And I think as we move forward into climate change, a large part of my work is now looking at future responses to climate change. One of the
Mm.
big concerns is that these conflicts become stronger, that these enemy narratives become more marked, because people will be feeling very anxious, under a lot of stress, and maybe direct trauma from climate impacts. They're going to be looking for narrative structures that allow them to project their anger somewhere. They're going to be saying, who is responsible for this mess?
Mm.
And by the way, that can bubble up in lots of horrible directions. I mean, we've seen the first intimations of that, for example, in India, where Muslims have been blamed for flooding Hindu lands as a deliberate act of what was
Mm.
labeled, climate jihad. We're going to see situations where the anger on climate change could very easily focus onto conflict, by the way, which might not be about climate change. I mean, I think one of the potential dangers of warfare and conflict emerging from climate change is that it's a coping mechanism, a defense mechanism against climate change. In other words,
Mm.
that it might be about water or some climate related issue, but it might simply be that in this massive bubbling pot of anger, grief, stress, anxiety, and trauma, that you respond to that by picking a fight.
Mm.
As we know, it's
Yeah.
it's what we do as humans. It's also
Mm.
incidentally what we do when we get hotter. There's a
Yeah.
lot of good research to show that interpersonal conflict increases
Mm.
significantly under conditions of high temperature.
Mm. Mm. Well, look, George, I think there's a lot there, a lot to digest, and a lot of very important points to take away, sit with, and figure out what we can do better. If you could leave the audience with one, two, three very key messages or key takeaways that you think are critical to understand in the context of our conversation and your work and research, do you have any key points you would like to leave us with?
Okay. Yeah, I'll try and do these in bullet points. Okay. First thing, um, social psychology is very important, and I think it's critically important for understanding how we are and how we will respond to climate change. We have to understand and anticipate the behaviors which are coming down the line, because These are predictable on the basis of our understanding of how we've responded in the past, who we are, how we're made up. But we need to be ready for that, and that these will not necessarily be a rational response to the issue, or we might say they're rational within the logic of our group identity. I think the second thing we need to do is we need to recognize that we need to recognize and respect a range of different identities from across the board. And the word I keep coming back to, the framing, is around contribution. We need to recognize that everybody has something important to contribute to this. The word contribute and contribution works particularly well with people of more conservative values, and that's why I always recommend using it. So we need you, and I want to see people who are on the activist side reach out much stronger and say, we need you. We're not going to agree on everything, nor should we, but we need your help on this. I also call on people of more conservative values to absolutely take ownership of this issue in terms of that. Relating to that, we do need people to speak out and be trusted communicators. Both communicators at a higher level, but I also really stress the importance of communication on an interpersonal level. It's easy to assume that communications and building collective awareness on things is all about large-scale communications, that it's about advertising campaigns, or that it's about finding the right slogan, or about high-profile messengers and well-known celebrity voices, by the way, which I often think is a very counterproductive line on climate communications. And yeah, that's helpful and important, and it can go wrong if those high-profile people are speaking against climate action. But I think where action really happens is interpersonal. It's about the conversation you have with somebody, who's a member of your family, or a friend, or a neighbor, or down the pub, or the RSL, or whatever it is, and in your own community, who maybe does a little bit of local initiative, or, like I was saying, maybe something like, how can we prepare and protect ourselves against climate change, or this kind of thing. And I think that's really the front line of attitude and social change, is the conversations that happen between people. All of the social psychology research shows that our perception of the norm, of the views and attitudes of people around us, is absolutely the starting point of our attitudes. In fact, it can dominate everything else. If you believe that the people around you think something, you're quite capable of ignoring the evidence of your own eyes. That's what happens when their house might burn down and they still say, actually, I don't think climate change is real. But the way to shift that is by shifting the social norm, of enabling and supporting, really encouraging people to say, I think that this is important. And that's most important in places where they might be surrounded by people who don't agree. So we want to really support and champion and respect for people who, within their own community, prepared to say, I don't think you're right, mate. I think climate change is a real problem. And I think that we need to speak out on this because our voice needs to be heard, and we need to be ready for this. That's the point where it changes. By the way, that's also the point at which people from across the political spectrum, when they talk to people on their doorsteps or their focus groups, and they say, what are the important issues for you? They start hearing climate change is important. Because until they do, as we find in every election that happens, we've just had one in Britain, there's been one in the States, we find climate change doesn't get mentioned at all because it's not present in people's minds. So it's that social salience of making it relevant. There's a few bullet points. Very long bullet points, I have to say.
I hope there was a few periods in those. Yeah. No, look, I think that's a great way to end our conversation, George. Thank you very much for joining me. And look, if any of our listeners want to find more information about you and your work, where can they find it?
You can find my contact details on LinkedIn. Also, I've done a lot of presentations and video work. So if you go on YouTube and you look for, there's a very famous Senator George Marshall. So you have to look for George Marshall Climate, then it will pop up. I think people listening might also be very interested by a TEDx I did some years ago called How I've learned the most from people I disagree with, which is really talking about what I've been talking about here, this thing about going out and opening up a conversation with people who don't agree with you on it, learning from it, and doing it in a situation that is both respectful to the fact they hold their views, but not compromised by the fact that you don't say, well, you don't pretend you agree. You go into the conversation position saying, you know what, we're not going to agree about this, but I'm really interested to hear what you think and why you think it. And so taking the conflict out of the interpersonal and making it a respectful exchange of views is so important. Anyway, have a listen. It's on YouTube.
Well, I highly encourage you listen to the Tech Talk. It's excellent. But look, thanks for joining me, George. Stay with me in the virtual green room. But again, thank you very much for coming on my podcast.
You're very welcome, Xavier. Thank you.